Welcome to the Archive Room podcast.
The Nation Station, Men's Radio.
First am I'm Judith Lay, and I'm very pleased to find you waiting for me at the door to the Archive Room, the place where we keep stories of island life in years gone by, told by the people who were there. So come on in, sit down and make yourself comfortable, and let's listen to this week's selection. And in this edition, we're name-dropping in the best possible way. Exploring the Baldwin Valley in the 1900s, going behind the scenes at the Gaiety Theatre and meeting an energetic young man doing business with the farming community between the two wars. In other words, another collection of fascinating insights into island life taken from the Manx Radio Archive Room. So let's get started with a finish. In August 1971, the Lady of Mann made a farewell trip to the Calf of Man before she left the Isle of Man for good. Louise Quirk was our reporter on that occasion, and she spoke to Captain Corteen.
What personally would you like to see happen to the lady now?
Well, the age is upon the Lady of Mann, the same as the age creeps upon us all. So the time comes when we must stop. So I'm afraid the lady, well, I cannot see anyone buying to run her because it would be too costly to do the extra maintenance required, and if anyone buys it for a museum, well, I don't think anyone could afford to keep it for a museum, so I'm afraid it will be the burners.
It's very sad. I hate to see the death of a ship. What's your feeling about the way that ships are built these days? Are they built like they used to be within the years when the Lady was built?
There will never be another cross-channel vessel like the Lady of Mann. I mean, you've seen the last of the original type of cross-channel steamer, because now they're only garages, aren't they? They're all garages with living quarters and an engine, car carriers. There's no make or shape.
There's no heart and soul to them?
No, nothing. It's just a business.
Well, Captain, what's going to happen now to you after leaving the Lady?
Well, I'll have my holidays now, and then I will relieve one of the masters in one of the car ferries, I expect.
How many more years do you expect to be with the steam packet company?
I finish in January.
A very sad occasion for you.
Well, I'm for 49 years, so I think I have had plenty.
Well, Captain, thanks very much for talking to me, and all the very best for the future and your retirement too.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Louise Quirk talking with Captain Corteen on the Lady of Mann's farewell trip. And it's not only vintage stories that I find in the archive room.
You know, I really like cars. I like how they look, the noises they make, and the way the number plates are all different. So I hang around the docks a lot, watching the cars drive on and off the steam packet. That way, I get to see thousands of motors. I once asked a man what the big deal was about taking a car across on the steam packet. Extra freedom, he said. Allows you to take more luggage, and it's great value for money. Nice bloke. I asked another man if cars, right, with the handbrakes on, affected the speed of the boat, slowed it down. But he wasn't as polite as the first. Steam packet, very good news for motorists.
And now, as we say, for something completely different. We're leaving the sea terminal and going down Douglas Promenade to the Gaiety Theatre, where we find Peter Kelly and David Callister in the year 1986.
The Gaiety, Peter, was built around the turn of the century, I believe.
Well, just before that. In fact, it was in 1893 it was first built, and at that time it wasn't called the Gaiety. It was built as a large pavilion, and to use the words of the local newspapers at the time, to accommodate 2,000 people for dancing and other amusements. In fact, it was rather like a large hangar, similar in style internally to the old Derby Castle ballroom.
A bit unsightly?
Certainly far more unsightly than the pleasant building we've got there today. It was very plain and simple.
The theatre now, though, was the work of Frank Matcham, wasn't it?
That's right. The original building was designed by Renison, an architect who'd come here from the Manchester region. But Matcham was brought in after the property had been purchased by what later became the Palace and Derby Castle Company. And his brief, if you like, was to convert what was there into a proper theatre. So the four walls remained, the roof remained, and what he did was a marvellous job of extending the walls on the front to hide a rather unsightly gable, and then inside a complete disguise. It was like a stage set where he created a new dome ceiling which totally belies the fact that up above was just corrugated iron sheeting.
It had been left over the years to decay somewhat.
Yes, I suppose you could call it decay by neglect rather than purpose decay. It was purchased by the government in the same way as, of course, Bishop's Court and the nunnery were for the sake of the nation. But this is one building that government hung on to and has spent quite a bit of money on. And I think one talks of cost effectiveness. It is cost effective because people are using the theatre now. People are appreciating the advantages that theatre gives to life. And also, of course, there's this marvellous building inside which people travel, I can assure you, from far and near to come and look at the work of Matcham. And unaltered, untouched work of Matcham, which is even more important.
Matcham was, I believe, a theatrical architect, was he? I mean, it's not a thing you could make a living at today, is it?
Well, if your fees were high enough, you might make a living out of. But no, he was responsible for literally, easily 1,000 either new theatres or theatre alterations. He wasn't by himself. Obviously, he had staff working for him. There's no way he could do all this work. But the overall design was his. It just then got passed to the boffins for drawing out once he'd done the sketches.
And the visiting artists and actors who come to perform at the Gaiety are always saying what a marvellous theatre it is and how precious it is and so on. Is it a unique survival?
Well, not unique. There are other Matcham theatres surviving. It perhaps has more than others. Some have the original trapdoors, as in does the Gaiety. Some have the other original workings. The Gaiety has the lot. So I suppose in that sense it's unique by having everything left from the day it reopened as the Gaiety Theatre, 16th of July, 1900.
Thank you to historian Peter Kelly, giving us an insight into the origins of one of today's architectural gems, the Gaiety Theatre. And here's David again, this time with a musical challenge.
And is this an organ or isn't it? Music created to sound like an organ when a keyboard is connected to a computer. Roly Drower and A.D. Evans as the Sulby Phantom Band.
The Sulby Phantom Band giving us an early experience of electronic music. And there were other new things that we needed to learn about too.
I can't get over it. He never forgets to send a card for my birthday.
Don't worry. It's probably just stuck somewhere in the system.
From Monday the 1st of November, that could be the case for any letter posted to or in the UK which doesn't carry a postcode. If you don't know the postcode of the address you're writing to in the UK, phone 686 105 and we'll give it to you.
Listen, isn't that the postman?
Yes, and this looks like your card.
Bless him.
Manx Radio from the wonderful Isle of Man.
It's not just the stories that are vintage when we're in the Manx Radio archive room, but it is the very place to meet people who give us a real insight into island life in years gone by. I mentioned earlier that in this edition we'd be name-dropping, but in the best possible way. And that's because I'm sure there'll be many people, especially those with farming connections, who are going to hear familiar names and places mentioned in this 1999 edition of the Farming Programme, as Leslie Bannan talks with John Kennaugh about his working life as a young man in the 1920s.
As a background, my father, over 100 years ago, was born in the village of Agnish up above Laxey. At that time it was a mining village and, of course, there were farms in the area. So my father was a typical Manx country boy. His parents died very early in his life. The children were farmed out to other families. My father was reared with a family called the Olivers. There was John Oliver, who was a miner and later lost his life in the mines. His children became very well-known people. Joshua, who was the butcher in Laxey village for many years, he knew all the farmers in the area. He was a Methodist local preacher. His brother Elijah was an evangelist, and Ben worked in R.C. Kane's with my father and stayed with us for a while. He eventually became a Methodist minister. So my father, at an early age, had come into Douglas, and he'd have to walk in and walk back home on the weekends. And he served an apprenticeship in the drapery trade with one man called Martin Smythe, who I've actually met, and he later with R.C. Kane's. Well, of course, R.C. Kane supplied country people and farmers and people of various sorts from all over the Isle of Man in those days. But on May the 12th, 1920, my father branched out on his own at number 12 Castle Street. I remember one farmer's wife who used to come every Saturday regularly, and occasionally she would bring a chicken. Well, instead of my parents paying for the chicken, she would buy goods and a little deal would be struck. She'd have the clothes and we'd have the chicken. And in those days, a chicken was thought a luxury. My father died around about 1929. After a little while, my mother gave up the shop when I was age 17. And then at 19, I opened my own draper's shop in Ridgeway Street. Now, this was right bang in the centre of where the farmers came to. T.W. Kelly's, the seed merchants, was one side. J.J. Cowley's corn merchants was in Ridgeway Street, and I was bang in the middle. Clegg and Crane's, the seed merchants, also. On the quay there was Collett, Sons and Cowley. So I was bang in the middle of the farming community. Some farmers who had milk rounds, they would be in collecting milk bottles in T.W. Kelly's. So I met some farmers every day of the week. But on a Saturday, that was the day the farmers came to town, and in those days they were seen gathering outside.
Boots the chemist.
Boots the chemist, that's right. Boots the chemist. They'd be stood in the corner outside Boots the chemist. You'd see them stood there with their hands in their pockets, keep their hands warm, because farmers didn't wear top coats, and they'd be chatting there. Being amongst them so much, I decided to go out travelling amongst them for orders, and I'd go south one day, west another day, and north another day.
But you're only quite a tender age at this time, Leslie.
Very tender age, 19. So I was a very young man going out amongst matured farmers.
And how would you travel in those days?
Well, I had a car. I didn't know anything about them, but somehow I managed to make it go out and come back. When I went south, I'd go via the North Quay and out along Lee Terrace and along the Nunnery Road. And it was very different in those days, no traffic. And I would come to Quines Hill if I was going south. And at the top on the left, I think the people in there at those times were Cowan Ballamona. Cowell Ballamona. But I only remember them as the father and the mother, and of course the usual thing of the very wonderful friendliness and hospitality. And if you're there, say when there was a mid-morning snack being served or midday dinner, I got a share in with these very kind people. And then when you went up the hill a little further, it was a sort of a little village, and there was be a village post office in those days, and the Methodist chapel. Both of those are gone now, I think. But on the right, as you go out of this village, there was a farm. There was a Mr. and Mrs. Taubman in it, and they had a son, Leslie. Well, this Mr. Taubman was a very interesting gentleman. In his early days, there was a place a little further along the road, it's still there, Kroger Castle. And as you're going past it, you notice in behind it, there's a coach house. And I think there's a notice on the wall saying coach house. Now, in Mr. Taubman's day there, they had this coach and four, and the family would be riding in state with these coachmen stood on the back. And Mr. Taubman had actually in his early days been one of these coachmen. There's a relation of the Taubmans in the House of Keys today to do with agriculture, a doctor's wife, Mrs. Hazel Hannon. She is a branch of that Taubman family from that farm at the top of Quines Hill.
So when you were going to these houses, Leslie, what actually were you offering? What were you carrying in your car that you could sell to them?
Well, I was born and reared as a proper general draper. All bedding and all household things and all underwear for children and men and women. So I was really an old-fashioned draper. So I was coming to see what they needed for the house or for their own clothing, outer clothing or underwear.
And would this cover sort of farm clothing as well?
Oh yes, I had Wellingtons for the farmer himself and heavy farm boots. But I found for their clothing, they quite often used perhaps one of their best suits that had seen better days. And they would use these old trousers to go work in. And an old one that had been their Sunday jacket at one time, but that would now become their working jacket. They wore old clothes to go out in the fields, doing the general field work on the farm.
You mentioned heavy boots. They really were heavy boots, weren't they?
Yes, you could get them up to a tremendous weight. The best boot was always a Scotch boot, and it would keep any water out. Cost a lot of money in those days, but that was a very, very heavy boot. Farmers don't wear them today. Today, I suppose, with the tractor, a man will go out in what we call a town shoe and sit in the tractor, but not in those days. And all of these farms in those days employed men. Some lived in, some had a farm cottage. And quite common in a farm at midday, at dinner time, there'd be 6 or 7 people round the dinner time table, and if I arrived at that fortunate time, I was included in, and I'd given a seat at the table, and I mucked in with everybody and met the farmer, his wife, and all who worked on the farm.
Now, that wouldn't exactly be by accident, would it? You would have worked out that would be the time to meet the farmers and their families and their men, and but you couldn't arrive at every farm at dinner time, could you?
No. Well, you may be in a farm and you would be told straight away there was absolutely nothing they were short for that week. That could make a quick call. But if you got talking and mentioned all the things in the house that wear out, and curtains and bedding and underwear, you got going, well, you could be there quite a long time, right, and dinner time would arrive. So then, as I say, you would be fortunate and you'd join the family round the dinner table with the farmer's wife and the farm workers. Going further along that road...
we're going out through Quines Hill now, and we're just leaving the little hamlet of Quines Hill. And who would you come to next? Well,
you could turn into Seafield, where there was a Walty Callow, and he had 2 sons, I think, 2 daughters, and Mrs. Callow. Little thing I remember about them, always, every day after dinner, Walty and the boys would have an old football, and they used to take this out and kick it about. How they had the energy to do that after a farm dinner, I don't know, but I didn't join in with them. But Walty Callow and his 2 sons, they called one of them the Captain. I don't know how he got that name, but he was known as the Captain, and the other fellow was Jimmy, who was later farming on his own and used to have a spud and various farm produce round in Douglas and Pulrose.
And when you went out in the morning, you would have your round. Would you know what time you were going to get home at night? Or,
no.
Or would your calls run into the evening as well?
Well, I would be there till quite late at night sometimes. But I can recall the main names of the farmers, which, though still people living in the country, some of these, the older folk, these names may bring back memories. They spread these out about all over the place. I think of Jim Looney, Ballafrere, on the Ballahutchin Road going up to Union Mills, famous, well known for his horses. Further up the road, Tom Cowell, Glenlock, with a big milk round in Douglas. And then further along the road, Proctor Ballywilly Killier, just a general farmer. And then there was my great friend Neddy Clark, the Rock, with Mrs. Clark, the daughter Evelyn, the boys, who I had the little fiasco over the suits with. But Balla Lease at St. John's, Balladis, where John Kennaugh is now. Can't remember the name of those people. I remember one daughter became a matron in the Cronkrua nursing home. One son became a policeman. And, as I say, John Kennaugh's got that farm now.
I think you'd be thinking on the Quails. The Quail family.
Quail Balladis.
Quite a notable family.
Yeah. And when I went further along that road, before I came to your farm, John, there was a farm very near the road, but about 100 yards runway into it, Shenhara. And they had a son who became an MHK.
That'd be Aliad Callan would be in there, yes.
Yes. So that was going along there on the way into Peel. But if you came back and went up Ballacrane up the road to Cronkavuddy, there were a Quirk family at the top. What's the name of that farm?
Lamphel.
Quirk Lamphel. That's right. Well, I well remember Mr. and Mrs. Quirk there, and there were 2 boys and 2 girls. There's still one boy in there, and he's a Methodist local preacher.
Walty Quirk.
Walty Quirk. But Mr. and Mrs. Quirk, when I called there, they were great for wanting to know all that had happened all around the Ound and in town. And I can see now, when I close my eyes, stood in that living room, Mr. Quirk, Mrs. Quirk, and they all seemed to be about in the house. There was the boys and the 2 sisters. So that was a very good, very friendly call.
But that would be a point, Leslie, wouldn't it? The news wouldn't travel so easily as it does today, and any visit to a farmyard, especially an outlying farm, would be quite a welcome visitor as far as bringing news was concerned.
Yes, of course. When the people didn't have cars, there were even some farm workers who only came into town on the Hollandtide time. So anybody calling in those days, the pre-motor age, providing they were a decent person and didn't come on the farm and pinch stuff, but when you came in a proper manner, you were a very welcome caller. But there are a number of these calls that I will never forget, and the people I'd like really to mention, pay a tribute to them. Some people who farmed Eroween. That's out the very far end of East Baldwin, and it's a very rough road out to it. Well, the days I'm talking about, the farmer there was a Mr. Tommy Moore, there was his wife, and there were 2 daughters and 3 or 4 sons. And it was a hard farm to work, to get any return off. Mrs. Moore and her daughter Amy at the time used to go into Douglas in their car and go round amongst people they knew and collect laundry and bring it out to Eroween, wash it. And I think the water out there was good water. It was very good for that sort of thing. Anyway, they had ample business in this direction. They would bring this car full of laundry to Eroween. Mrs. Moore and the daughter would wash it, hang it out on the lines to dry it, then iron it and fold it, and then on the weekend they went into town with the car. I've seen it loaded with this washing.
So hard times in farming, Leslie, are nothing new. You've seen it in your day.
I have seen it. At Eroween it was a very hard farm. It wasn't good soil. It's really a mountainous place. Perhaps best for some tough sheep. But I recall I'm going there, it was usually a Friday, and Mrs. Moore said to me, "Mr. Bannan, I wish you'd have a look at Tommy. He's upstairs in bed, he's ill." Went up with her. I had no need to enter the bedroom. I could tell what was the matter with him from on the landing. His breathing. It struck me, with no medical knowledge, here was a man in a very advanced state of pneumonia. Well, there was a Dr. Gange at Avondale at those days, and he was married to a sister of Mrs. Moore. I got him a car and dashed back into town to Dr. Gange, told him a story, and he gathered some stuff, and I took Dr. Gange back out to Eroween, and he went up and he attended to Mr. Moore. Well, he was very, very ill. I left Dr. Gange there. I think he stayed all night, but Mr. Moore didn't survive that. He passed on.
But it was all hard work up in those places, wasn't it?
They're all hill farms.
Yeah.
And all the farms out in East and West Baldwin are hill farms.
Yes.
And it's all very, very hard work indeed.
That's Leslie Bannan sharing memories with John Kennaugh of the farms and farming families that he visited in the 1920s as a young man selling clothing and household textiles. And Leslie's memories of farming in the Baldwin Valley lead us nicely into more stories from someone who knew and loved that area so much that he wrote a book about it called Baldwin, My Valley. Here's Tom Cowell talking about life and work in the early 1900s in East and West Baldwin as he walked round the village with Manx Radio's senior producer, Charles Webster.
Actually, we're standing in West Baldwin village, just beside the old chapel, and the noise you hear in the background is the River Glass coming down over the bywash. Now, the bywash was a piece that was channelled off to take water over the village for the old corn mill, which crossed the Baldwin village at the head of the Glendarrick Valley. And if you stand now, you'll see 3 bridges. The middle one was where there was a wooden viaduct which took the water to the mill. And just behind me, you see the remains of the old West Baldwin railway station. And across the valley, from where I'm standing by the chapel, you see the North Star Inn. Now, just by the North Star Inn, there's a little lane coming down, which was the lane the miners came down from the slate quarries on Colden. Now, as we proceed over the village further to our left, you see what is now called Bridge House. Now, Bridge House was originally the hall belonging to the Westling Chapel. And just to the left of the chapel, you see another little lane going up, which led up to our West Baldwin laundries. We'd 2 laundries there in years gone by.
Why would they have laundries in Baldwin for?
Well, the people in West Baldwin were very poor. And there was an old gentleman who had a horse and trap, and he used to collect the laundry from the boarding house in Douglas and bring them home, and the people used to wash the clothes and iron them and do them to make a few coppers to live on. Now, up the same lane, you'll find a little ruins of a house where a man called Philly the Desert lived. Now, he helped to compose the Manx wedding. Now, as you proceed over the village, you'll come to now what we call the Young Men's Reading Room, which was originally the mission church from Ingebrek. Because when they built the Baldwin Reservoir, they had about 100 men working there, and quite a lot of them were Irish navvies. And they had their own priest, choir and organist at that time.
So Baldwin was a very busy place in those days?
Baldwin was a very busy place. We had 3 pubs.
3 pubs?
3 pubs, I'm afraid. And also there was a smithy in the village, 2 lead mines in the village, and an undertaker.
It's unusual to have 3 pubs with a Methodist sort of community, wasn't it?
Actually, the 2 valleys were split up. You had the church on the hill and 2 Methodist chapels, one in East Baldwin and one in West Baldwin.
What was the church on the hill then?
It's called St Luke's now, but it was originally Kilabin, or pronounced Killibane.
Well, how did the people in the village do their shopping? I mean, it was too far to go to Douglas. And what about the posting and the mail?
Well, actually, in the village, they had 2 little shops. Shops selling paraffin and general goods, but opposite it was a post office, which was run by Mr. George Callister. And he used to walk to Douglas every morning to collect the mail and walk it back again, sort it out and deliver it to the 2 valleys.
There was no horse and trap in those days?
No horse and trap in his days, no. He didn't even have a bicycle. If you come to West Baldwin now, as you come into the village, you'll see a bush shelter. Well, where the bush shelter is, the little shop stood, which sold all general goods. But opposite is a house called Ellen Veen now, which was the post office. Even when I was a child, we used to go there to buy our sweets and stamps and things. 1945 it closed down, and because in years gone by, it was good trade for the shops because you had miners working in the mines, you had people working in the woolen mills, paper mills, and farm labourers and things.
So how many people would have lived here in the sort of the turn of the century then?
Getting on for 300 people lived in the valley.
That's Tom Cowell, lifelong resident of Baldwin, walking round the village with Manx Radio's Charles Webster over 30 years ago. And as this is the last in the present series of The Archive Room, these final words from Leslie Bannan's conversation with John Kennaugh seem to me to be particularly appropriate.
We all know that you became a Methodist local preacher. Were there any experiences that you encountered in your rounds that maybe you've drawn on later on?
Certainly a very important lesson that I learned is that in this life we all depend on one another. If a doctor has got toothache, he has no option but to go to the dentist. If a dentist has got appendicitis, he has no option but to go to the surgeon, the medical man. I've learnt that we all do depend on one another. When I'd be going round the country late at night, I've had punctures, and in bad snowy times I've been stuck in ditches, and I've had to call on farmers at midnight to come and drag me out of a ditch. I reckon that I received support and friendship, and if you did a little business in one farm, it gave you courage to go on to the next. But the friendship of these people and the genuineness, I will never forget. I love our Manx countryside, and I love our Manx country people.
Leslie Bannan, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, John.
I love spending time in the Manx Radio Archive Room, and I'm so very grateful for the time you've spent in here with me over these past weeks. Don't forget that all the Archive Room programmes are available as podcasts via manxradio.com or your usual podcast provider. I'm Judith Lay, closing the Archive Room door, returning you to the present day and wishing you a very good evening.
The nation's